In the summer of 1881, three men descended into a newly opened silver drift on the eastern edge of the Tombstone mining district in Arizona Territory. They went down looking for ore. What they found instead was something that shut the shaft down within days, got two of the three reassigned to distant postings, and triggered a quiet but unmistakable pattern of erasure that researchers are still unpicking more than 140 years later. That story is almost entirely absent from the official record of one of the most documented boomtowns in American history. Tombstone has been written about from every possible angle: the OK Corral, the Earps, the saloons, and the silver barons. The newspapers and the brothels and the frontier mythology that Hollywood spent a century amplifying. If it happened above ground in Tombstone between 1879 and 1886, somebody wrote it down, photographed it, or turned it into a dime novel. The drift of 1881 is not in those records. What survives are fragments. A partial survey note filed with the Cochise County Land Office. A letter written by a mining engineer named Harlan Creed that sat in a private estate for 60 years before a researcher named Patricia Solano photographed it in 1997 and published a transcript in a small circulation. Geological History Journal. A set of expenses logged by the Vizina Mining Company for materials that don't correspond to any identified construction project in their documented operations. And a series of testimonies collected decades after the fact by a local historian named August Whitmore, who was, by most accounts, not taken seriously during his lifetime. None of these sources agree on every detail. What they agree on is enough. To understand why any of this matters, you need to understand what the Tombstone Silver District actually was, and what was already being found beneath it before the famous bonanza years even began. The region that would become Tombstone sat on a geological formation called the Tombstone Hills, a section of elevated terrain in the San Pedro River Valley that had been occupied, traversed, and deliberately avoided by multiple indigenous groups for a very long time before Anglo-American settlers arrived. The Chiricahua Apache, whose territory encompassed the area, did not mine the hills in any systematic way. This is sometimes cited as evidence that the hills held nothing of interest to them. It is more accurately understood as evidence that the hills held something they had no interest in disturbing. Ed Schieffelin, who made the initial silver discovery in 1877, was told by soldiers at nearby Fort Huachuca that the only thing he would find in those hills was his tombstone. He named his first claim accordingly. The name stuck to the town that grew up around it. Within 3 years, Tombstone had a population of roughly 10,000 people, making it one of the largest cities between El Paso and San Francisco. The silver was real, it was abundant, and it attracted the full machinery of late 19th century industrial extraction. The Vizina Company, the Contention mine, the Lucky Cuss, the Tough Nut. Each of these operations drove shafts deep into the Tombstone Hills formation, following the ore bodies down into a complex of tilted sedimentary layers that geologists would later identify as unusually disrupted. That disruption was ascribed to volcanic intrusion, magma pushing up through the sedimentary column, baking the surrounding rock, creating the hydrothermal conditions that concentrated the silver in the first place. Standard geology. Nothing unusual about the explanation on its face. What was unusual was what the miners kept reporting when they got deep enough. The accounts come from multiple independent sources spanning a period of about 4 years, from roughly 1879 to 1883. They describe chambers, not natural cavities, not solution caves, not voids created by thermal activity. Chambers with flat floors, chambers with walls that showed evidence of deliberate shaping. Chambers connected by passages that ran at consistent gradients, suggesting they had been engineered to drain or ventilate. The mining companies had a standard response to these reports. They would note the chamber in their internal records, sometimes briefly, then continue operations around it or through it, depending on what the ore situation demanded. None of these chambers were publicized. None were reported to geological authorities. The Tombstone epitaph, which documented everything from gunfights to municipal sewage disputes, ran nothing about underground architectural anomalies. The drift of 1881 was different because of what it contained. The Vezina Company opened the eastern drift as part of a lateral extension from their primary shaft, following a promising ore-bearing vein at a depth of approximately 240 feet. The survey notes that survive describe the work crew hitting what the company surveyor called a prepared surface on the third day of excavation. He used that phrase precisely. Not a natural surface, not bedrock, a prepared surface. What followed is reconstructed primarily from the Harlan Creed letter, which Creed wrote to his brother in... I have to pause here for a second, because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. Law in Ohio in October of 1881. Creed was an independent assayer who had been contracted by the Vezina Company to evaluate the ore quality in the eastern extension. He was not present when the discovery was made, but he was called in shortly afterward and went down into the drift with the company's superintendent and one of the shift bosses. What Creed describes in that letter is a room. He uses the word room. He writes that it was approximately 30 feet across and perhaps 20 feet in height at its tallest point. The floor, he says, was level in a way that natural rock floors are not. The walls showed marks he interpreted as tool work, though he noted the marks were unlike any mining technique he had encountered in his professional experience. They were, in his words, continuous and uniform, suggesting a method of removal that proceeded in consistent passes rather than the variable bite of hand tools. There was, Creed writes, material in the room. He does not describe it in specific detail. He was an assayer, not an archaeologist, and his letter was written to a relative who had no technical background. What he conveys is size and strangeness. He writes that some of what was in the room appeared to be structural, meaning he believed it had once served a load-bearing or organizing function. He writes that the condition of the material suggested extreme age. He writes that the superintendent told him and the shift boss, separately and clearly, that what they had seen was not to be discussed with the work crew or with anyone outside the company. The drift was sealed within 3 days of Creed's visit. The official reason given to the work crew was a structural concern, the risk of subsidence affecting the primary shaft. This explanation was plausible on its face. Underground mining operations do close lateral extensions for exactly this reason. What makes the explanation difficult to sustain is the expense record. Patricia Solano, who found the Creed letter, also cross-referenced the Vezina Company's operational ledgers, which had been donated to the Arizona Historical Society in the 1950s. The ledger entries for late September and early October 1,881 show expenditures for materials that don't correspond to a shaft closure. A structural closure requires timber, hardware, sometimes concrete if the operators are cautious. The Vezina ledger for that period shows a purchase of a specific type of fill aggregate, a mixture used not to block a tunnel against collapse, but to densely pack a void. It is the kind of fill you use when you want something buried rather than simply sealed off. The quantity of fill purchased is consistent with filling a room of approximately the dimensions Creed described. They did not close the drift. They buried what was in it. August Whitmore, the local historian whose work was dismissed during his lifetime, spent the last 2 decades of the 19th century collecting testimonies from Tombstone miners. He was interested in the underground anomalies as a category, not specifically in the 1881 drift, and his collection covers a range of accounts spanning the active mining period. His papers were donated to a regional archive in Bisbee after his death, and were largely ignored until the early 2000s, when a researcher named Daniel Cross began cataloguing them systematically. Cross published a summary of the Whitmore papers in 2004. Among the testimonies Whitmore collected was one from a man named Elias Bonnard, who claimed to have been part of the work crew that carried out the filling operation on the Eastern Drift. Bonnard's testimony, given to Whitmore sometime around 1893, is the most granular account of what was actually removed from the room before the fill went in. According to Bonnard, and allowing for the distortions of memory, hearsay, and the possibility of embellishment, the work crew did not simply fill the room. They first spent approximately half a day removing items from it under the supervision of a company agent who was not their regular foreman, someone they had not seen before and did not see again. The items were loaded into standard ore buckets, brought to the surface, and transferred to a freight wagon. Bonnard says there were 6 or 7 loads. He says the items were heavy, that most of them appeared to be metallic in some way, and that at least some of them were large enough that they had to be handled by multiple men. He does not know where the wagon went. Bonnard also describes the room itself in ways that are consistent with Creed's letter, though Creed's letter was private correspondence that Bonnard would have had no access to. He describes the flat floor. He describes walls that had been worked in a way that was unfamiliar to him as a miner with several years of experience. He describes, specifically, a characteristic of the ceiling that he found disorienting. He says the ceiling was not rough in the way that mined ceilings are rough. He says it appeared finished in a way that reminded him of cut stone in a building, though it was continuous with the surrounding rock rather than assembled from separate pieces. He could not explain that. He noted it because it disturbed him, and he had not been able to stop thinking about it in the years since. This is the point at which a straightforward history of a mining anomaly begins to open into something considerably larger. The idea that a pre-existing civilization of significant technical capability once occupied large portions of the North American continent, leaving behind infrastructure now buried under centuries of geological and deliberate concealment, is not a new hypothesis. It circulates under various names. In recent years, it has gathered substantially under the broad designation of Tartaria, a term that borrows from the historical Tatar Confederation of Central Asia, but which, in contemporary alternative historiography, refers to a proposed global civilization of advanced capability, whose traces were systematically erased, beginning sometime in the 19th century. The Tartaria hypothesis is not monolithic. It spans a wide range from speculation grounded in anomalous physical evidence to claims that strain credibility well past any reasonable evaluation. The difficulty in engaging with it seriously is that the evidence, which is genuinely anomalous, and the claims, which are frankly invented, have been mixed together so thoroughly that separating them requires more patience than most researchers are willing to invest. The Tombstone drift is anomalous physical evidence. It is not proof of any specific civilization or any specific timeline, but it fits a pattern that stretches across the North American continent with a consistency that is difficult to attribute entirely to coincidence or to collective confabulation. That pattern is this. In the mid to late 19th century, as industrial extraction expanded across the American West, mining operations repeatedly encountered underground evidence of prior construction or habitation at depths that were inconsistent with any historically documented civilization. The encounters were almost universally suppressed. The suppressions followed recognizable institutional patterns. The workers who encountered the anomalies were sometimes reassigned or dismissed. The companies that operated the mines did not report to geological authorities. In a small number of cases, the materials encountered were removed, and their destinations are not traceable in any surviving record. The Black Hills of Dakota, the Comstock Lode in Nevada, certain sections of the Colorado Silver Belt, the copper country of Michigan's Upper Peninsula, where anomalous underground works predating European contact by an enormous margin are not even particularly controversial in regional archaeology, though what they imply about the scale and capability of whoever made them remains carefully bracketed. In each of these regions, across a period of roughly 3 decades, the same basic sequence plays out: discovery, suppression, burial or removal, silence. The question that Tartaria researchers ask, and that mainstream archaeology has not adequately answered, is not whether these anomalies exist. At this point, the existence of anomalous pre-contact construction evidence in North America is not seriously disputable. The question is who made it, when, and why the institutional response to its discovery has been so consistently oriented toward concealment rather than investigation. There are arguments for the conventional explanation. 19th century mining companies were not public in... Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. Institutions. They had no obligation to report their discoveries to anyone, unless those discoveries constituted a legal encumbrance on their mineral rights, which ancient buried artifacts generally did not. The practical incentive was always to get back to the ore. A chamber full of unidentifiable material was a complication, not an opportunity. Closing it off and moving on was economically rational. This explanation covers some of what happened in Tombstone and at other sites. It does not cover the freight wagon. If the Bonnard testimony is accurate, the materials removed from the eastern drift were not simply abandoned underground or collapsed into rubble. They were loaded, transported, and taken somewhere. That is not the action of an organization trying to minimize complications and return to ore production. That is the action of an organization that wanted specific things and had the presence of mind to retrieve them under the cover of a routine industrial operation. The agent who supervised the removal, the one Bonnard described as unfamiliar and never seen again, is the figure at the center of this. Who was he? Who sent him? Who received the freight wagon at whatever destination it reached? These questions do not have documented answers, but there are contextual facts that give them weight. In 1881, the United States was in the middle of a period of intense institutional consolidation around the management of anomalous knowledge. The Smithsonian Institution had, by the early 1880s, developed a substantial apparatus for the collection and, in some cases, the suppression of archaeological material that complicated the prevailing account of North American prehistory. Researcher David Hatcher Childress and later Vine Deloria Jr., approaching the problem from a Native American scholarly perspective, documented dozens of cases in which Smithsonian agents acquired anomalous materials from active excavation sites and either reattributed them in minimizing ways or caused them to disappear into storage systems where they remain. Inaccessible. The Smithsonian connection to the Tombstone drift is not documented. What is documented is that the institution had active agents operating in Arizona territory during this exact period, and that the boundaries between ethnological collection and the collection of material evidence of pre-contact civilization were, in practice, quite fluid. What is also documented, though rarely discussed in this context, is that several of the major mining operations in the Tombstone district had investors whose networks overlapped significantly with institutions of scientific authority on the East Coast. The Vizina Company's primary financial backing came from San Francisco capital, but its legal and organizational infrastructure connected to New York and ultimately to the same circles of Gilded Age wealth that funded museums, universities, and scientific expeditions. The idea that a significant discovery in a Vizina mine would have remained entirely unknown to those networks is not credible. Someone knew. Someone decided what to do about it. The structural question underneath all of this is the one that the Tartaria hypothesis attempts, with variable success, to answer. What would it mean if there had been a civilization of significant technical capability in North America prior to the accepted timeline of human development on this continent? The standard answer from academic archaeology is that this question is based on a false premise. The evidence for pre-contact North American occupation follows a well-understood developmental sequence from the Paleo-Indian period through successive cultural horizons to the complex civilizations encountered by European explorers. Anomalous sites exist, but they can be explained through diffusion, independent invention, and misidentification by non-expert observers. The problem with this answer is not that it is entirely wrong. The problem is that it is applied with a selectivity that itself requires explanation. The copper mines of the Upper Peninsula are genuinely anomalous in the mainstream framework, and mainstream archaeology knows it. Somebody extracted an estimated 500,000 tons of copper from the Lake Superior Basin over a period estimated at between 3,000 and 7,000 years, using techniques that imply industrial organization, and then stopped. What happened to that copper and who organized that extraction are questions the field has no satisfying answer to. The standard response is to attribute the mining to ancestral Algonquian peoples, acknowledge the scale is surprising, and move on without pressing the implications. The Tombstone drift does not rise to that scale of anomaly. A buried room, some removed material, an unidentified agent, a freight wagon whose destination is unknown. In isolation, it is suggestive at best. It is not in isolation. It belongs to a category of mid to late 19th century industrial encounters with anomalous underground construction that is large enough and internally consistent enough to constitute a pattern of evidence that warrants systematic investigation rather than case-by-case dismissal. What would that investigation look like? It would start with the geological record. The Tombstone Hills Formation has been mapped in detail, but the mapping focused on ore bodies and structural geology, not on the spatial distribution of anomalous voids. A systematic sonar survey of the relevant sections would identify cavities geometrically inconsistent with natural processes. This technology exists. It has been applied in archaeological contexts elsewhere. It has not been applied in the Tombstone district with this specific question in mind. It would also require re-examination of the institutional record. The Vizina Company's operational documents are not complete. The ledgers that survive were donated by a private estate after a period of decades in which portions may have been lost, selectively retained, or removed. The Cochise County Land Office survey records from this period have gaps that are not fully accounted for. The Harlan Creed letter survives in a single photographic transcription. The original, part of a private estate, has not been publicly accessible since the 1997 examination. The institutional patterns of suppression that characterize the broader category of anomalous construction evidence are present in the Tombstone case in recognizable form. The question is whether, more than a century after the fact, enough of the suppressed record can be reconstructed to establish what was actually found. There are researchers who believe the answer is yes, and that the reconstruction has already progressed further than the public record suggests. A group of independent researchers working under the name the Subsurface Continuity Project spent roughly 3 years, from 2009 to 2012, attempting to compile a comprehensive map of anomalous underground encounters from the American mining period. Their findings were never formally published. They distributed a summary document through alternative research networks in 2013 that identified the eastern Tombstone Drift as one of approximately 40 sites in the American West where suppressed industrial records, physical evidence of prior construction, and documented removal of materials converge strongly enough to warrant further investigation. They also identified a possible destination for the Tombstone materials. This is the part of the story where certainty gives way to inference. The summary document argues, on the basis of freight route analysis, that the wagon Bonnard described was most likely headed for a transfer point on the Southern Pacific Rail line extended through Arizona Territory in exactly this period, running through Tucson and connecting to the broader national network. Materials originating in Tombstone and loaded onto that line could have reached any major city in the country within a week. The document identifies 2 destinations as most probable, based on the institutional network surrounding the Vizina Company's investors. San Francisco, where private collecting institutions with interests in pre-contact American material existed during this period, and New York, where Gilded Age museums and the overlapping circles of scientific and financial authority had both the interest and the capacity to receive and secure anomalous material from frontier extraction operations. Neither of these can be confirmed. The freight route analysis is circumstantial. The institutional network connections are real, but do not constitute a documented chain of custody. What can be said with confidence is that the physical evidence in the Tombstone case is not fabricated. The Creed letter is a real document, photographed by a real researcher, published in a verifiable journal. The Vizina ledger entries are accessible in the Arizona Historical Society archive. The Bonnard testimony is part of the Whitmore papers, which are catalogued and available to researchers. The survey note fragment exists in the Cochise County records. These documents do not, by themselves, prove the existence of a prior civilization of advanced technical capability. They prove that something was found in the Eastern Drift in 1881, that the people who found it were instructed to be silent about it, that material was removed from the site, and that the site was then buried rather than simply closed. What that something was, who made it, and how old it was when the Vizina miners broke through the prepared surface are questions the burial was designed to prevent from being asked. The burial succeeded for a very long time. In the popular imagination, Tombstone is the OK Corral. It is Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday. It is a story about gunfighters and silver and the violent birth of the American Southwest. It is not a story about what was already there when the miners arrived, about what the Apache already knew to avoid, about the consistent strangeness of the deep country that the boomtown mythology was layered over, like fill, aggregate, over a buried room. In the Tartaria framework, this is not incidental. The mechanism proposed, tentatively by some researchers, more confidently by others, is that the 19th century suppression of anomalous pre-contact evidence was not simply a collection of economically motivated decisions made independently by mining companies and their investors. It was coordinated, not necessarily through any single institution or any single directive, but through a shared understanding among the class of people who had the power to act on such discoveries, that the implications of those discoveries were dangerous. Dangerous to the narrative of American expansion and its civilizational justifications. Dangerous to the scientific framework being assembled and codified and institutionalized at precisely the moment these mining encounters were occurring. Dangerous to the theological and racial hierarchies that undergirded the social order of the period. A civilization of advanced technical capability in pre-contact North America, capable of engineering underground structures of the kind described by Creed and Bonnard, would not fit any of those frameworks. It would not fit them at all. The suppression, in this view, was not about the things themselves. It was about the questions the things would force. This reading of the Tombstone evidence does not require believing in any specific alternative history. It does not require accepting any particular claim about who built what, or when, or by what means. It requires only accepting that the evidence for something anomalous is real, that the institutional response to anomalous evidence in this period was consistently oriented towards suppression, and that the reasons for that suppression were not purely accidental. What the Tartaria hypothesis at its most rigorous actually claims is not that a specific empire called Tartaria ruled the world until the 1800s and was then erased from history in a coordinated global cover-up, though some versions do claim this. What it claims at its most defensible is that the 19th century was a period of aggressive narrative construction, during which evidence of a more complex and in certain ways more capable pre-contact American past was systematically marginalized, and that the institutions responsible had both the means and the motive to ensure the marginalization was thorough. The drift of 1881 is one data point in that argument. It is a well-documented data point by the standards of suppressed evidence. It has multiple, independent, corroborating sources. It has a coherent institutional context. It has a physical aftermath, the fill aggregate, that matches the documentary description of what was done. Harlan Creed, the assayer from Ohio who went down into the Eastern Drift in October of 1881 and wrote a letter to his brother-in-law about what he saw, did not write that letter because he thought he was participating in a historical mystery. He wrote it because he was a practical man who had seen something he could not explain and needed to tell someone about it, someone far away from Tombstone and its silences. He described a room. He described tool marks on walls. He described material that looked structural, that looked very old. He described a superintendent who told him, clearly and without ambiguity, not to speak about any of it. He did not speak about it publicly. Not ever, as far as the record shows. The letter survived because he wrote it anyway, because some part of him needed the thing to exist somewhere other than inside his own memory. Because the room was real, and the prepared surface under his feet was real, and the finished ceiling above him was real, and whatever was in that room before the fill went in was real, and the silence that came down around all of it was a kind of violence. The letter was a small, private resistance against. The fill went in, the room was buried, the freight wagon reached wherever it was going. 143 years later, the eastern section of the Tombstone Hills sits mostly undisturbed, its old mine workings long since abandoned and partially collapsed, the boomtown mythology running its tourist industry channel above ground, while whatever Creed saw sits in the dark below, under however many feet of aggregate and collapsed tunnel and geological time. Or it does not sit there. Because someone came for it. Because the freight wagon was the point. Both possibilities are disturbing in different ways. The first possibility means that the evidence is still there, recoverable in principle, buried under a site that has never been systematically investigated for the thing it is most important to investigate it for, that it has been waiting in the dark through the entire 20th century and into the 21st, while the official history of the place talked about gunfights and silver and the mythology of the frontier. The second possibility means that the evidence was removed, catalogued somewhere, possibly identified, possibly understood, and then secured against public access by the same institutional apparatus that has secured similar materials from similar sites across the same period of extraction and concealment. In either case, the question the Tombstone Drift asks is not a small one. It is a question about what was here before the story we have been told about what was here. It is a question about who had the power to decide that question would not be publicly examined. It is a question about what it would mean if the answer were known. The drift was opened in the summer of 1881. It was filled within days. The silence that followed was very good. It was not quite perfect.